Well, a little bit about me. Um, so I'm, as you can tell, I'm not in the first flush of youth. I'm a medical doctor. So I started off, actually, I started off wanting to be a molecular biologist, because
Mm,
when I grew up in the 1950s, that molecular biology was the cutting edge subject. Watson and Crick had just published their famous paper. And I then went to university, to Cambridge University, and realized I wasn't cut out to be a research scientist. So I switched over from biology to studying medicine.
mm,
Um, so I sort of had a science degree first, then I'd had a medical degree. And at that time, you may not have heard of him, but there was a very famous a Scottish psychiatrist called R.D. Laing,
mhm,
wrote a book called The Divided Self. Um, and he was a kind of existential psychoanalyst, a very charismatic man. And of course, in one's adolescence and young early adulthood, one is very susceptible to charisma. Um, and so I thought I wanted to step into follow the footsteps of R.D. Laing. So I decided to train as a psychiatrist. Um, in fact, I didn't go straight into psychiatry. I then worked for a while as a physician, internal medicine, and then as a general practitioner. And then I trained in psychiatry. And
mhm,
I trained at the Institute of Psychiatry in London. And rather liking politics, you have left and right. So in psychiatry, you have biological psychiatry on the one hand and psychosocial psychiatry on the other. So, of course, I was drawn to psychoanalysis and to psychosocial psychiatry. And so I then became a consultant psychiatrist at University College London,
mhm,
and practiced as a psychoanalyst or psychoanalytic psychotherapist and a psychiatrist. So I was trying to bring psychoanalytic and psychotherapy ideas into psychiatry, individual therapy, group therapy, family therapy, couple therapy. Um, I'd always been very interested in the work of John Bowlby because and attachment theory, because I've always felt, because I had a sort of science background, the scientific foundation of psychoanalysis is flimsy, is not strong. And what I liked about attachment theory and John Bowlby's work and Mary Ainsworth is that it provided a scientific and evolutionary foundation for psychotherapy and psychoanalytic work. And then I was lucky enough to get a Wellcome Fellowship for a year. So I gave up my clinical work for a year and was able to um, study, research attachment theory and also the biography of John Bowlby. And I wrote a book out of that called John Bowlby and Attachment Theory, which is still in print, actually. It's done quite well. By that time, I'd moved to a more rural area, so I was practicing in a sort of quite a self-contained community in the west of England. And I continued work like that and continued writing, continued researching, particularly in the field of personality disorder, especially borderline personality disorder. And then I retired from the National Health Service and continued in private practice, but also set up a psychoanalytic um, uh, research program and training program in the west of England, which still runs. And so that was really trying to set up a kind of psychoanalytic psychotherapy centre away from London. Because until that point, anyone who wanted to train as a psychoanalyst or train in psychoanalytic psychotherapy had to travel at least 4 hours, and that was very, very difficult. So, and then, as I say, I retired. I'm now sort of four-fifths retired. I still work 1 day a week, seeing patients and doing mainly supervision, in fact, online. So I work from my home online. I do occasionally see patients in real life, but it's mostly online. So that's where I am now, and I've just published a new book, which I might talk about in a little while. But okay, well, that's a really good question, and probably we need to write a paper. The first book that I published, I wrote with a philosopher in the 1980s, and it was called The Values of Psychotherapy.
Yeah.
And our idea in that book was we had to think, well, what differentiates psychotherapy from other disciplines, from medicine, for example, or social work? And we thought that the key difference or the key contribution of psychotherapy was what we called autonomy, that psychotherapy empowers an individual, as it were, to be themselves, to be autonomous, to make choices, to have agency. And agency is very often absent in clients who come to see us. They don't feel in control of their own lives. And especially women who have been oppressed or abused, they've had no agency, they're victims. And so we thought that the key idea or the key feature that psychotherapy brought was autonomy, and we try to link this back to 19th century utilitarianism and John Stuart Mill and the idea of autonomy, which is one that he developed. Now, if we go forward 40 years from the 1980s to the 1920s, I think what's changed is that we now think in a much more complex relational matrix. We think in terms of relationships as the crucial issue. Relationship to the self, relationship to one's loved ones, or to one's family, or to one's immediate circle, but also relationship to the environment, to the political context, and to the ecological context. So I've definitely moved from seeing my job as helping people to be autonomous to seeing my job as helping people to find themselves in satisfying relationships.
Mm.
Now, that doesn't mean you have to be married or have a partner, or, I mean, relationships is a more general sense, and quite a few of my clients in the past have lived alone, or they've had bereavement, or they haven't formed a relationship. And it's important not to impose the idea that psychological health and relationships are identical. So I think that's a big change. And of course, the other, or another big change at least, is that, I don't know how to put this and how this would work in your context, but psychoanalysis was essentially a white middle class occupation. Certainly in the West, certainly in the UK, I would say in the United States and in Europe as well. You have to have space in your life, you have to have a bit of money, you have to have a kind of, if you think of the Maslow hierarchy, you have to have a roof over your head, a job, an income, some degree of physical health, etc. So now I think we have a much broader concept that we've got to think about how psychotherapy can help people from different ethnic backgrounds, how psychotherapy can help people who are struggling economically. And we have to think about the idea of what the role of the psychotherapist is. You know, the famous Lacanian psychoanalyst Zizek described the analyst as the one who knows. Well, we now no longer are in that position. We are no longer in a kind of authoritative expert on the unconscious, as it were. We are forming a collaborative relationship with our clients in which together we are exploring. And what the psychoanalyst brings is experience and the capacity, particularly to mentalize, this extra dimension to think about thinking and to help the client to begin to think about their own thinking, which will enable them, as it were, to connect more adaptively to the environment they find themselves in. So I think there has been a huge change in the 40 or 50 years that I've been in practice.
Mm.
I'll just say one or two things about this. The basic parameters of psychoanalytic work, I don't think have changed and should change. So maintaining the boundary, about therapeutic reticence, so that the client, the therapist won't. I mean, some relational psychoanalysts I'm very critical of. They want to talk about themselves and their difficulties. I'm totally against that because the focus is always on the client. The boundaries need to be absolutely secure. So, of course, there are ethical issues there, but that hasn't changed. I mean, there should be no exploitation by the therapist, sexual exploitation, financial exploitation, reputational exploitation, no exploitation. That's completely unethical and needs to be monitored, policed, I might even say. And I think transference is hugely important in the way we work. And to elicit transference, we need to offer an ambiguous stimulus to the client. Because it's the ambiguous stimulus, the ambiguity of who the therapist is, that means the client will then project their own inner world onto how they experience the therapist. So I think the fundamentals haven't really changed. Where I think what is different, I think, is a movement away from what I'm calling authoritarian psychoanalysis, the sense that we have some kind of special knowledge of the unconscious, and towards that we have a special knowledge of relationships. And therefore, the way we work with the client is that we're always thinking with them about their relationships with their in their external world and their relationship with us, and how there's a kind of fundamental set of assumptions and values which they bring into relationships, which are maladaptive. And it's our job, as it were, to create some kind of change, some kind of crisis, some kind of reorganization of those fundamental dysfunctional relationship patterns. So that's, and I just wanted to add one more thing, which is I'm a great believer in not knowing. We have to enter into a state of receptive uncertainty. And if the psychoanalyst thinks they know the answer, then they are almost certainly wrong. So every psychoanalytic encounter is an exploration with the psychoanalyst and the patient into this world of the unknown, and they're going together into that world of the unknown, which you could call the unconscious, because it'll be manifest in dreams and transference. And I haven't mentioned countertransference. I think this is the great contribution of Bion and the Kleinian school, which is the use on the part of the therapist or the analyst of their own countertransference reactions as a clue to the client's underlying difficulties.
But it's quite difficult to be not knowing when you have a lot of knowledge and concepts and schemes and protocols in your head. How do you deal with this? Because it's very.
I think this is an interesting issue, and I think it is developmental in the sense of our development as we need to think about what is the developmental process of becoming a psychotherapist. And obviously, I'm at the end point. So I think when you're starting off, you do need protocols and guidelines and theories, and they keep you on track and make you feel that you are doing something useful. But I think as you develop as a therapist, then these become internalized. I mean, so it's a little bit like learning to drive a car or something. To begin with, you have to think, where's the gear? Where's the brake? How do I steer? What does that sign up there mean? That kind of thing. But then it becomes semi-automatic, let's say. And just in terms of how I try to work now, I mentioned countertransference earlier, but I see myself, I sort of put myself to one side when I'm working, and I just try to listen to whatever's coming up inside me, whether it's a theory or a reaction, a thought, and I feel that that's coming from my unconscious, and I try to use it with the client. I mean, I give various examples of this. Once I was seeing a client, and there was a holiday break coming up, and I was just sitting there, and I noticed one of the plants in my room and the flowers in my room was looking very, very thirsty, and I hadn't watered it for a while. So I realized, of course, that really it was the client who was feeling thirsty and wondering who's going to feed him when the holiday break came up. So I think when you're setting out as a psychotherapist, of course, you need to listen to your protocols, your teaching, you need to read all the textbooks, and you need to read Freud, you need to, but I think you need to read Tolstoy and Dostoevsky as well. And then as you sort of become more experienced, then you're beginning to sort of listen to yourself more. I rather like something that there's a wonderful psychoanalyst called Glenn Gabbard. You may have read his work or heard of him in the United States, and Thomas Ogden, two of my heroes, both of them actually. And they wrote a paper about the sort of what's it like to graduate as a psychoanalyst. Mm-hmm. And they say to graduate as a psychoanalyst, you have to, number one, honor your ancestors, and number two, kill the father. In other words, you need to be in a tradition, but at the same time, you have to find your own way forward and your own style and your own voice. People who are writers talk about finding your voice. I think you have to find your voice as a therapist. Now, when I set out as a therapist, I used to, I think, say the things which I thought my teachers would say, or the things which I thought my psychoanalyst would say. And then now I like to think I speak with my own voice. So to begin with, we are like children. I don't know if you have any children, but your daughter might go to your closet and try on your shoes, your 3-year-old daughter. Well, we're a little bit like that, aren't we? We try on the shoes of our teachers, but sooner or later we have to find the shoes which fit us. I don't know that I can really answer that. I mean, it's just I love my work. I feel so lucky to have been able to work in this way. And I suppose I would say it's because I find other people, absolutely fascinating. And it's so moving to be admitted into the inner world of another person. Having said that, of course, psychotherapy can be exhausting. And if you're working 5-6 days a week and seeing 8 patients each day, you're going to be very tired. So it's very important to look after yourself. And the ways of looking after yourself are very important. You must always, if you're feeling unwell, it's good not to work. And of course, we psychotherapists need our own therapy. So we need, if you're a young psychotherapist, you definitely will be having your own therapy. But even at my age, I had a brief period of psychotherapy only. I think I saw a therapist actually online for about 2 years when I was in my 70s, because I had various difficulties in my life and bereavements. Um, so, well, that's my answer to your question. So this gives me a chance to go on to my new book, which I call The Spirit of Psychotherapy.
Yeah, we wanted to ask about this, of course. Yeah.
And in a way, I'm going in the opposite direction with The Spirit of Psychotherapy, because what I've got, the idea of the Spirit of Psychotherapy is to say psychotherapy isn't just one more treatment, like you take paracetamol if you have a headache, so you take psychotherapy if you're depressed. It's also a kind of secular spirituality. See, in the West, it may not be true in your part of the world, but certainly in the United Kingdom, I would say in Europe, perhaps less so in America, we are essentially living in a secular society. There's no religion anymore. Yes, of course, there are plenty of religious believers, but they're a minority. So most people don't follow any particular religion, and they might say that they're something like, I'm spiritual but not religious. And the idea of my book is, or one of the ideas of my book is that that psychotherapy now occupies a kind of social space that previously was occupied by religion.
Mm-hmm.
And in what way does it? Well, number one, it's a kind of safe space. I usually give the example of Eastern Germany in the days of the Stasi. The Stasi kept away from churches, and people could get together and talk about their real feelings and their real situation in a kind of church space. Well, I think a psychotherapy space is a sacred space in the same way. The client will talk to you about anything and everything that they would never talk about outside that room. Secondly, the psychotherapy space is about the inner world. Now, again, in the West, at least, certainly in our country, everything is more and more on the surface. People send you a photograph of what they had for breakfast that day on their social media, but how they felt at breakfast has disappeared. So another thing that psychotherapy provides, it's a kind of guardian or a custodian of the inner world. There's nowhere else that inner world is preserved. Whereas previously, the inner world was the preserve of religion in a way, because God knew about your inner world, sort of thing. So, and I've got some neuroscience rationale behind what I'm saying as well. So my new book has, and the previous book, just called The Brain Has a Mind of Its Own, also brought some really interesting neuroscience ideas into this conversation. So, and then I think the third point I wanted to make was that it's what I call psychotherapy praxis. So there's a kind of existential aspect to psychotherapy where you have two people in a room together, or if it's a group, it'll be 8 people in a room together. And there's a huge emphasis on the here and now, on what's happening right now in the room, what the feelings are, what the relationships are, what the to and fro patterns are. And again, I feel that encapsulates, as it were, the spirit of psychotherapy. So I'm trying to say that psychotherapy has a kind of spiritual dimension. It's not theistic. It's a secular spirituality, and it is about this sacredness of the psychotherapy space. It's about the inner world, and it's about this idea that there's a kind of here and now praxis or practice that's encapsulated in the work that we do as psychotherapists. And that is a sort of vital dimension which I feel needs to be held on to and developed. So that's there's quite a bit more in my book, but that's sort of one of the basic ideas that I try to promote in that book.
Thank you.
I'm not sure that my views, I have any very interesting things to say about it. All I can say is it seems to work. And on the whole, it's not very different to face-to-face work. I think when I started, or of course, when I started, it was quite often telephone. Before the internet, I'd have clients who would travel abroad or something like that, and they'd want a telephone consultation.
So,
And I think I used to speak too much. I think now
what do you mean? What do you mean?
I'm more relaxed. I can let a silence happen online, whereas to begin with, I found it rather difficult. Whereas in face to face, I'm very happy to create a space, a silent space. But there is only one thing. I do think it's useful to meet your client at least once in the flesh, in real life. The difference is the setting, which is kind of weird because you see your client's room, you may see their cat, you may see or hear their partner.
Yeah.
So, in one sense, the transference aspect is a little bit different, I think. But I still think the general principles of psychoanalytic psychotherapy work, or psychoanalytic work, apply whether it's online or face to face.
What do you think it's important for psychotherapy to be effective?
Oh, yes. So are you saying what needs to happen for psychotherapy to be effective?
Yeah.
Or, well, 2 points. One is because we are in a social context, a political context, psychotherapy, and certainly in the West, um, uh, an evidence base is required for any kind of social or medical intervention. So, I take various medications, I've got an illness. I don't want to take a medication that is useless or worse than useless, will make me ill. So we need to have good evidence that psychotherapy is effective. And although the evidence for psychoanalytic psychotherapy is less strong than the evidence for cognitive behavioral therapy, there is still good scientific evidence to show that clients who have psychological difficulties who are treated with psychoanalytic psychotherapy improve as compared with people who are given some kind of control intervention. So we need to have effective therapy. I'm a follower of an American researcher called Wampold, who believes, and I think he's right, and I think he's shown he's right, factors in psychotherapy are common factors. And the common factors are reliability, regularity, empathy, concern, focus, these kinds of things. These are the things which help the client to get better. And then on top of that, you may have specific interventions, such as working in a transference or working with mentalizing, that may add an extra amount of improvement. So we have to say there are common factors which produce a degree of improvement, and then we have some extra factors or specific factors from particular form of psychotherapy that produce a certain amount of increased improvement.